Hey everybody, it is Professor Parish and we are on Module 3 for English 123 already. So I want to go over the assignments for this week. I'm recording this on Sunday, so hopefully you have the reading response and the topic and outline for paper 1 completed by now. So far, the topic and outlines, they've been great. I've really liked those. I thought those were wonderful. Y'all did a really good job on those. But I'm really excited to read your drafts for those papers so far. So that's pretty exciting. But let's go ahead and pull up Module 3 and talk about it. So with Module 3, let's go ahead and talk about that. If you look on here, there are some reading assignments for this week, and they'll correspond with your reading response number 2. So the stories that I'd like for you all to read, first there's Introduction by Denise Durmill in the Best American Poetry. Definitely check that out. And then there are a couple of poems that I'd like for you all to read for the second reading response. The reading response number 2 is going to be based on poetry, so we're going to get like a little bit of a preview ahead of what's to come. But there's The Art of Drinking Tea by Nin Andrews. There is 5 1-Minute Eggs by Andre Codrescu, and there's Green Man Blue Pill by John Hennessy. So there's a couple of different poems on there that I want you all to look at. And then obviously watching this lecture video, and then we'll talk about the discussion forum and then reading response number 2. Let's go ahead and talk about reading response number 2. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up here so y'all can see it. But yeah, like I said, we're going to kind of preview poetry here, even though y'all are still working on your short stories. I do want to go ahead and preview poetry a little bit and start talking about it because as several of you noted in your discussion forum, some people are really big fans of poetry and others not so much. So if anything, if you get anything out of this class, I do hope that you gain an appreciation for poetry, even if you end up not enjoying it or liking it. Like, I'm not expecting poetry to suddenly become your favorite genre, but I do hope that by going over these poems and talking about them in the discussion forums and etc., that we gain an appreciation of it, because it really is language at its finest. In order to craft a good poem, you have to specifically choose the right language, the right words. You have to coordinate it and make it all flow. If you have a rhyme scheme, you have that to worry about. So there's a lot of elements in poetry that I think a lot of people forget about. So we're going to talk about that once we get into the poetry section, but this will just be a nice preview for that. So after you read those 3 poems and that introduction from our poetry book, I would like you to construct this reading response that answers these questions. And again, it's just 1 to 2 pages, double-spaced, 1-inch margins, brief intro, brief conclusion. Those of you that have done the reading response so far have done a really good job with it. So I applaud you for that. Great work. So question number 1 is, do these 3 poems share any commonalities? And if so, what are they? So there are different poems, but is there any themes or elements that are similar between the 3 of them? So I'd like to know that. Question number 2, how does form and pattern vary between each of these poems? So again, this is the first question is asking how are they similar? The second question is asking in terms of how they are formed and the rhyme scheme, the pattern, how are they different? And then finally, which of the poems do you like the most and why? Which do you like the least and why? So very much opinionated questions. I'm curious to know which of these 3 caters more to your style of poetry, if you even have a style of poetry that you like, and which you like the least. So there's no wrong answer to number 3. I'm just very curious to know which you liked the most and which you enjoyed the least and why. So that's a pretty straightforward reading response, and then those questions and elements there are due by Sunday. So with that being said, the only other assignment for this week, you are working obviously on your papers at this point. I didn't put that in the assignments, but it's assumed that you're working on your drafts at this point. Discussion forum number 2 is talking again about short story. We're not totally abandoning short story this week, but it is talking about short story and the idea of unreliable narrators. I really like this kind of trope in narration has become something I really like over the last couple of years, and the idea of who can you trust, the unreliable narrator. And we're going to be watching a lot of Lindsay Ellis's video. She's an author. She's a graduate from NYU, and she does a lot of video essays that I really like. I like her style. I like her humor. Her humor's not for everybody, but in this series, it's for PBS. It's called It's Lit. Bom, bom, bom. Womp, womp. And this series talks about literary tropes and genres and things like that. So this is more of her doing a video for PBS, so it's just really more informal, informational, and educational. But she talks about the idea of the unreliable narrator, which I think is really cool. So I want you to watch this video. It's not very long, And then afterwards in the discussion forum, I want to know, first of all, what is the overall point of the video? Do you agree with Lindsay's argument about unreliable narrators? Why or why not? You don't have to agree with her, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are about the entire unreliable narrator genre. And then think back to 2 stories from reading response number 1. Could either of those narrators be considered unreliable? Why or why not? And I'm going to be interested to know what y'all say about this, because I think I won't spoil anything, but I'm very curious to hear what you all think about it. And then in the story that you're writing for this class, paper 1, is your narrator reliable or unreliable? If your narrator is unreliable, why? And if they're not, would you ever use an unreliable narrator and explain your answers? So it's curious. I think that I would use an unreliable narrator myself, but it would be you'd have to really think about it and find a way to make it weave into the story and it be a surprise to the audience and not make sense. Kind of like in Frozen when Hans reveals himself, at some point in the story and you're like, oh, okay. So it's one of those scenarios. I'd want it to be a surprise, but I'm very curious to know your thoughts about this topic and what you answer for the questions. And then, of course, you have to have at least 2 responses to your peers, and your posts are due by Sunday as well. So I don't have a lot to say more for this week. Last week, so far, the reading responses that I've looked at have been really good. I've really enjoyed your conversations about Navigators and The Other Place. I think that those are 2 stories that they're very interesting. Several of you have pointed out so far about The Other Place it could be its own novel. And I absolutely agree. I think that the author could expand it and make it a giant work if they wanted to. So I've really enjoyed your answers so far with the discussion forums and with the reading responses for the class. So with that being said, as always, if you have any questions this week about paper number 1, if you have any questions about the assignments for module 3, please don't hesitate to email me and ask. But otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back very soon with Module 4's lecture video. Bye.